All right, so today is Algebra 1, Semester 2, Section 2.5 Apex version. So we're going to start talking about factors and what we use them for. So a 0 is the x-coordinate of an x-intercept. So this is the value where the entire function equals 0. So where the y equals 0. So the root or the roots, okay, are the same as a 0 in the related function. Okay, so they mean the same thing. Okay, so this is where our f of x equals 0. So remember, our y value equals 0. So what this looks like, if I have some function graph here, my roots or my zeros are everywhere where my y value equals 0, and this touches the x-axis. So how does this help us? So how a graph helps you to solve a polynomial equation. The first thing you need to do is you need to identify the x-intercepts. Okay. So you need to identify where the points of the graph touch the x-axis. The x-intercepts tell you the zeros of the function and the roots of the related equation. In other words, they tell you the same thing. They tell you the zeros are the roots. Okay. And then the roots tell you the polynomial's factors. So remember, when we take some quadratic and we break it apart, we break it into factors. So, you know, x minus 3 and x plus 2 would be factors. Okay, so let's take a look at how this works. So if b is a root of a polynomial equation, then x minus b is a factor of the polynomial. So in the example, we have y equals x squared plus x minus 6. If one of my roots is 2, then my factor is x minus 2. Okay, and the same thing, if negative b is a root of a polynomial function, then x plus b is a factor. So if my root is negative 3, then x plus 3 is a factor. So notice, okay, it's saying the same thing. It just means that I change the sign when it goes from being a root to being a factor. Okay. All right, so it says use the graph to answer the questions. So this one says, what are two zeros of the polynomial function? So in other words, where do these cross the x-axis? Well, this graph crosses the x-axis at x equals 2 and 4. So if those are my zeros or my roots, what are two factors of the polynomial? Okay, so when I write it as a factor, I change the sign. So it's going to be x minus 2 and x minus 4. Okay, so this one right here, the same thing. So it says find the roots. Well, the roots here is x, the 0 or the root is 2, or x equals 2. And my repeated factor in this case is x minus 2. And the reason it's a repeated factor is because it bounces off of this. If I were to factor this down, this is a perfect square trinomial, and it becomes x minus 2 squared. So it's actually a repeated factor of x minus 2. All right, however, graphing is not always accurate. So to find where y, right, our f of x equals 0 accurately, we're going to have to actually solve this thing using algebra. So the first thing we're going to do is set the equation equal to 0. So we're going to change the f of x or the y to 0, or we're going to add and subtract terms to get a 0 on one side. Then we're going to factor completely, and then we're going to set each factor equal to 0 to create new equations. After that, we'll solve each new equation, and that'll give us x values. All right, so let's take a look at why we do this. So the reason we do this is called the zero product property. The zero product property says that if we multiply two numbers A and B together and they equal 0, then either A or B or both must be 0. So in other words, if I'm multiplying 2 times some number and I'm getting an answer of 0, well, I know that X has to be 0. So that's why when I'm doing this, I'm taking these factors. So if I have a factor of X minus 2 times X minus 3 and the whole function equals 0, then either this one has to equal 0 or this one has to equal 0. So when I solve those by adding 2 to both sides, I get X equals 2 and I get X equals 3 here. Okay, so those would be my zeros. In other words, where my Y value, my f of X equals 0 is at these two X points. All right, so let's go on ahead and work a couple of these. So the first thing we're going to do is factor. So I always look for a GCF first. So in this one, I have an X to the third, an X squared, and an X. So I can take an X out of here. Then I'm going to go on ahead and write down what I'm left with. So 6x squared plus 5x minus 4. And now I need to factor this. So I'm going to use my A times C method. 6 times negative 4 is negative 24x squared. So now that could be 1 times negative 24, 2 times 12, 3 times 8. Okay. And in this case, it would have to be a negative 3 times a positive 8 or a positive 3 times a negative 8. So now that I know I'm getting close, that's why I'm starting to go on ahead and write the positives and negatives. So this one could have been negative 1 and positive 24. Okay, and this one could have been either this one negative or this one negative. I just wasn't doing that because I wasn't close and I knew that. So I have to get a positive 5x, so it has to be this one. So now I'm going to take that 6x squared, and instead of writing 5x, I'm going to write plus 8x minus 3x minus 4, and then I'm going to use my factor by grouping here. So I can take a 2x out of this one, and I'm left with 3x plus 4. Remember, I have to take at least a 1 out of this. Okay? In this case, I can take out a negative 1, and I'll be left with 3x plus 4. If these two don't match, I've done something wrong. So that's one of my factors. And there's my other factor. But now remember, one of our steps was to change this f of x equal to 0. Okay, so now I'm just going to rewrite my equation. So 0 equals, I pulled this x out in the beginning. It has to still be part of my factors. Okay, times 2x minus 1 and times 3x plus 4. Now I have to set each and every one of these equal to 0, because if this was 0, then this whole thing would be 0. If this was 0, the whole thing would be 0. If this was 0, the whole thing would be 0 because you're multiplying. Okay, so we're going to have x equals to 0, 2x minus 1 equals 0, and 3x plus 4 equals 0. Okay, so here x should equal 0. That one I don't have to solve. I'm going to solve this one, so add 1 to both sides. 2x equals 1, and divide by 2, so I get 1/2. Okay, and I don't know why I don't have a third blank here, but I don't. So subtract 4 from both sides, and I get 3x equals negative 4, and divide by 3, so negative 4/3. So I actually have 3 answers here. So x could be 0, 1/2, or negative 4/3. And if I plug any of those numbers back in here for x, okay, I'm going to get 0 as my final answer. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. So x squared plus 6 minus, or plus x minus 6. So my a times c is my negative 6x squared. So now I'm going to go on ahead and I'm going to find my factors. So 1 and negative 6, or negative 1 and 6. 2 and negative 3, or negative 2 and 3. Well, this has to be a positive 1, so it's going to be this one right here. Now I'm going to go on ahead and factor that. So I have x squared instead of x. I'm going to put minus 2x and plus 3x minus 6. Out of this first set of parentheses, I can factor an x, and I'm left with x minus 2. And out of the second parentheses, I can factor a 3, and I'm left with x minus 2. This matches, so I know I'm on the right track. And there's my other factor. So this entire thing equals 0. So now for this entire function to equal 0, either x plus 3 has to equal 0, or x minus 2 has to equal 0. So now I'm going to solve. Add 2, and I get x equals 2. So my x is either going to cross at -3 or 2. So make sure that you know how to factor, because that will be used for the rest of your algebra, geometry, algebra 2, calculus. Okay? This factoring is so important. If you don't understand factoring, you're going to struggle through the rest of your math lives. Okay? So if you're struggling with it, get some help. Make sure you know how to do it. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.